Caroline Astor firmly established herself as the grande dame of New York society in the 1880s. The city's old money aristocracy, who could trace their ancestry back to the colonial era, gathered for a social season from November to February under the direction of Mrs. Astor, as she became known. You would expect that a woman with her wealth and power would have a magnificent palace for her weekly dinner parties and annual ball. However, the mansion in which she spent most of her married life as she rose to prominence in society was shockingly a silent luxury. What is it all about, you will wonder? Today we will take you back to the times when Caroline Astor was the face of New York's socialite, to her majestic ballrooms at her primary mansion and the double mansion at 65th Street. We will go into details how and why the family moved out from their residence and what happened to the luxury landmarks after so many years and struggles between Astor family ancestors. Let's move on. Mrs. Astor was born Caroline Webster Schermerhorn in 1830 to a wealthy Dutch family with a long history of ties to New York's elite. Her early years were defined by exposure to the intricacies of high society and private education, which gave her a strong basis for the position she would eventually play and the most prominent mansion she would expose during her famous balls at Fifth Avenue. Fifth Avenue, Mrs. Astor Mansion, 34th Street. Constructed in 1856 on what was once Astor family farmland, the home is located on the southwest intersection of Fifth Avenue and 34th Street. The family gifted the lot to Mrs. Astor and her husband, William Backhouse Astor, after the couple married. It was in 1853 when Caroline wed William Backhouse Astor Jr., a railroad and real estate mogul in Trinity Church. The couple remained members of the church for the rest of their lives, first making the trek downtown from their mansion on 34th Street, and later from an even larger mansion on 65th Street and Fifth Avenue after an Astor nephew built what would become the original Waldorf Astoria Hotel. According to Eric Homburger, author of Mrs. Astor's New York, the pair constructed a plain 4-story townhouse on that land. The building's dimensions of 16 by 32 meters, along with the use of Nova Scotia freestone for window dressings, architraves, cornices, Corinthian columns, and a double stoop, gave it an air of grandeur. The next house on the block, located at 350 Fifth Avenue, which was built and occupied by William's brother, John Jacob Astor III, shared a fenced-in garden on the left side of Mrs. Astor's home. During the Gilded Age, the neighborhood was the city's most upscale residential sector. The interior was a different story, despite the unimpressive facade. Author Lloyd Harris, in his book Incredible New York, describes what attendees of Mrs. Astor's yearly January ball would go through as they entered the house, which was ablaze with lights. But not everyone was invited. The 400, a list that Mrs. Astor allegedly created, limited the number of people who were considered socially acceptable for her elite parties, marking the height of her authority. This list became the Gilded Age's social Bible, dictating who was allowed to attend the most significant occasions. In addition to reflecting Mrs. Astor's desire for exclusivity, the careful guest selection served to uphold the Gilded Age social hierarchy. Members of well-known families like the Vanderbilts, Rockefellers, and Morgans were among the attendees, enhancing the status and authority connected to these events. Even the invitations to Mrs. Astor's events were artistic creations. They set the tone for the opulence that awaited the lucky recipients with their elaborate designs and frequently beautiful calligraphy. These gatherings had an equally strict dress code that required the utmost refinement and fashion. The strict guidelines that guests had to follow further highlighted the exclusivity and sophistication of her events. Through a wide hall, guests proceeded to the first of 3 connected drawing rooms, where their hostess received them, standing in front of her life-size portrait which she had recently commissioned from famous painter Carolus Duran. After being warmly welcomed, her visitors proceeded to the large art gallery that served as a ballroom, passing through 2 more crowded drawing rooms. In the musicians' gallery, Lander's expensive orchestra was playing, and the walls were covered in artwork that had gained notoriety, but also merit thanks to Mrs. Astor's support. In other words, the setting of Mrs. Astor's balls was just as important as the activities. The ballroom's opulence, complete with gilded decor, crystal chandeliers, and hundreds of American Beauty roses in elaborate vases, immersed guests in an unmatched realm of luxury. After that, dinner would be served from a giant table in a grand dining room. It must have been spacious with 5 children and his and her bedrooms, but the top levels remained more private. Mrs. Astor's balls were frequently themed, and each one was more extravagant and inventive than the last. From historical reenactments to masquerade balls, the themes demonstrated Mrs. Astor's dedication to giving her guests an exceptional and memorable experience. These already lavish events were made even more sophisticated with special touches like custom decorations, personalized favors, and tailored meals. But nothing lasts forever, and so does her life in this magnificent mansion. Was there a special reason she left her famous home behind? Definitely, there is. Caroline and her nephew William's relationship had utterly soured by 1893. Caroline had declared herself the Mrs. Astor, the oldest surviving Astor wife. William, however, believed that since he was the male head of the household, his wife should be given the title. Following several social setbacks, William eventually lost it and was unable to put up with his aunt any longer. In order to build the first Waldorf hotel, which was supposed to literally and figuratively loom over Caroline's house, he demolished his brownstone mansion next door. Caroline was eventually worn down by the unbearable noise from the construction and the now busier neighborhood, and by 1896, Mrs. Astor and her son John Jacob Astor IV had moved out of their midtown brownstone and into their newly finished dual mansion, which had been designed by Richard Morris Hunt. The Astor Double Mansion, 65th Street. We are moving to the place Mr. Astor called home till her last days. After 3 months of exploring throughout Europe for ideas, Richard Morris Hunt chose a French Renaissance-style chateau from the early 16th century to serve as Caroline's new home. And it was a grand design. The new residence sat on the northeast corner of 65th Street, facing Central Park, and consisted of 2 separate homes adjoined by a glass dome entrance hall. From the outside, the structures appeared to be one colossal French Renaissance chateau, rivaling all of the other large mansions of the era. Caroline lived at number 841, and her son John Jacob lived at 840. Thus, in February of 1896, Mrs. Astor became officially a resident on Upper Fifth Avenue across from the park. The house was a double mansion and a main ballroom with a capacity of 1,200, 4 times the capacity of her ballroom on 34th Street. Jules Allard, a famous interior designer of Gilded Age mansions, created the exquisitely designed interiors, which were all completed in the French style. All of the rooms in both houses are suitable for entertaining, and the ground floors were built with that in mind. The ballroom was located at the back of both homes, while the ground floors had a huge stair hall, a modest reception room, a big drawing room, a dining room, and a pantry. The 3-story stair halls were located in the middle of the house. It was surrounded by the other ground-level rooms. The stair hall provided access to every room on the ground floor. John would typically withdraw to the drawing room to read alone or play the piano, while Ava played bridge in the reception area. The largest of the gathering spaces was the drawing room, which John and Ava utilized as a ballroom because Caroline dominated the real one. The house's dining rooms were the most ornate and elaborately furnished. The ceilings in both rooms had intricate details and paneling made of dark oak. Both dining rooms could accommodate 200 people, and included numerous big tapestries. Mrs. Astor opened the house with her yearly Patriarch's Ball and continued to host extravagant parties once the estate was properly refurbished. But by the 1900s, Mrs. Astor had become more of a shadow queen, and while Caroline continued to be a prominent figure, other people like Alva Belmont, Mamie Fish, and Tessie Ulrichs were primarily in charge of society. Mrs. Astor gave her last ball, her annual opera ball, the start of the season, in 1904, and in 1907 gave her last dinner party. But what happened next after Mrs. Astor's passing? Will this mansion survive? When Mrs. Astor died in 1908 at age 78, she was buried in the Astor family mausoleum in Trinity Cemetery, uptown in Hamilton Heights, survived at the time by 3 of her beloved children and 11 grandchildren. Her daughter Carrie was very close to her and commissioned the Astor Cross in her honor after her death. But it was her son John who set about converting the chateau into a single residence for him and his new wife, the beautiful but glacially cold Ava Lowell Willing. Ava was cruel enough to make public the truth that she had only ever married John for his money, and their marriage ended before the reconstruction was finished. Nevertheless, after completing the renovations, John hosted a housewarming party for 208 guests in February 1911. The total cost of the renovations was said to be $3 million. Thus, a welcoming party was inevitable. By September, a new, younger Mrs. Astor named Madeline had moved into his mansion. The following year, Jack tragically perished in the Titanic, leaving his young widow and their newborn son Jakey as the only owners. She gave over ownership of the chateau to her stepson Vincent Astor and his wife Helen Huntingdon in 1916 when she remarried. These far more socially aware Astors entertained at the chateau until 1924, when its contents were auctioned off and it was replaced by the Temple Emmanuel that stands in its place today. And eventually, you will wonder what happened to Mrs. Astor's first mansion. In the following years, after Caroline and her son moved to the double mansion, a well-known hotelman, George Bolt, managed to convince William Astor and John to join the mansion with the Waldorf Hotel to build an even grander hotel on Fifth Avenue. It was George Bolt who negotiated between the rival families to see them join forces and create the Waldorf Astoria. In 1897, the 16-story Astoria Hotel was finished, by which time it had been agreed that the two hotels would join together as one, known as the Waldorf Astoria, that the socialite Louise McAllister then popularly dubbed the Hyphen. And if we go to more recent years, after the original hotel was demolished, a new Waldorf Astoria was built following $550 million renovations. In 2014, the Anbang Insurance Group of China purchased the Waldorf Astoria, New York for $1.95 billion, making it the most expensive hotel ever sold. Finally, the memory of Mrs. Caroline Astor remains a pivotal moment in New York society's history. Her steadfast influence, demonstrated by the founding of the 400 and her lavish parties, permanently altered the Gilded Age's cultural landscape. The influence of Mrs. Astor, the queen of high society, went well beyond her life and continues to influence social dynamics in the center of the developing city to this day. If you ever had a chance to visit all of these landmarks where Mrs. Astor was living high, write down your impressions and thoughts about the times of the Gilded Age. We welcome any of your comments and would love to find out your true thoughts. Do you like watching documentary videos, or do you have other preferences, like any type of architecture? Leave your ideas below. We will create more videos to match your expectations. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to follow the channel.